Hello, my name is Murray Lumpkin, and in this module on the regulation of medicines, we're going to be talking about one of the major changes that have occurred in the last 20 years that has had a profound effect on how both high-income country and low-income country regulators approach their particular way of regulating. As you might remember from the first module, we talked about how often it is major catastrophes, public health catastrophes, that have led to changes in legislation and changes in the way in which we approach regulation. But in the last 20 years, it's not a public health catastrophe by any means, but rather a change in the way in which the world manufactures and delivers and develops their products, which has been called globalization. And it is this impact of globalization on the regulation of medicines that I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes exploring with you in this module. The objectives of this module are to try to help you integrate your understanding of the impact of globalization on the regulation of medical products in the past 20 years, and really take a much more in-depth examination of the impact of globalization on how clinical trials have been conducted as an example of the profound impact that globalization has had on this entire enterprise of developing, marketing, and authorizing medical products. And then I'd also like to spend a little time developing with you an understanding of some of the initial efforts that one regulatory agency, the US FDA, and some of the other regulatory agencies have undertaken to try to meet the challenges of globalizations as they try to meet their mission to protect and to promote the public health of their specific jurisdiction. When we talk about globalization within the context of medical products, I think we have to look at some of the facts of what's happened in the last 20 to 25 years. And this is because technology, economics, and capacity enhancements, medical products today are global commodities, whereas in the past, most of the medical products that were used in the United States were manufactured in the United States. Most of the medical products that were used in Europe were manufactured in Europe. If there was trade in medical products, it was often between North America, Europe, Japan. It was between the high-income countries because they were the manufacturers of the products. They were also the assessors of the products, and they were the major end users of the products. But now, because of globalization and many of the issues that we'll talk about in this module, those products are now global commodities. And it's not only the products that are global commodities, but the databases that support the utilization of those products, the databases that show what the products indeed can do, the databases that examine the toxicities of the products. These are a global resource now that are often composed because of the technology and where many of the studies and use of the products occurs. They're composed of data from around the globe. So you've got a product that is a global commodity, you've got a database that is a global resource, and you've got a world now, because of the communication technology that we have, where the communication about these products are indeed global communications, whether they are intended or not. So communication about a product in Europe is instantaneously known here in the United States and vice versa. And what happens in high-income countries is known extremely quickly in other countries also around the world and vice versa. What happens in other countries in the world and the messages that are given about products there becomes known very quickly to regulators in high-income countries. So the bottom line is, when we look at the life cycle of these medical products, whether we're talking about their discovery, their development, their manufacturing, their authorization, their marketing, their promotion, their use by customers and practitioners, This simply does not happen in geographic isolation as it did in the past. That's not the world of the 21st century. The bottom line is, when it comes to these medical products, it is a global supermarket. Whether it's the data, whether it's the product itself, it's a global supermarket, and people are shopping everywhere. As I mentioned, for decades, most products here used in the United States were of U.S. origin. But when you look at the data now, for active pharmaceutical ingredients, these are the chemicals, the basic chemicals from which finished products are made. 80% of those active pharmaceutical ingredients are imported from overseas. 40% of the finished pharmaceutical dosage forms that we use in the United States are now imported from overseas. 35% of our medical devices are imported. 80% of our seafood is imported. 50% of our fresh fruit is imported. And when you look at the number of pharmaceutical imports, that number has doubled in the last 10 to 15 years. And when you look at the number of medical devices that are imported, that number has quadrupled in the last 10 to 15 years. So the reality of globalization is not something that is theoretical. It is something that's very real, and it is something that is presenting a host of challenges, not only to the US FDA, but to regulators around the world who are trying to decide how can they best do their job for their local community and their local jurisdiction for whom they are responsible when the products are not local and they're coming from this global supermarket around the world. When you look at it in terms of dollars and cents, here in the United States, we import approximately $2 billion worth of FDA-regulated products. And these don't come from just a few countries. They come from roughly over 200 countries. There are about 825,000 importers whose day job it is to be responsible for importing FDA-regulated products into the United States. And these do not come in just in one port city or one international airport. There are over 300 ports of entry around the United States that these FDA-regulated products legally enter the United States. And as you can imagine, this represents millions of entries each year of FDA-regulated products that the FDA has to make a decision very quickly when these products are presented at the border. Do we allow these products in or do we not? Do these products meet our standards or do they not? And as you can imagine, this is a sea change from 10, 25 years ago when most of the products we were using indeed did not have to go through importation because they were manufactured here, and FDA knew what was happening in the plants and was responsible for inspecting the plants and making sure that what was produced did indeed meet the standards that the FDA and the American people expected those products to meet. As you can imagine, this globalized world of product production and marketing gives us many different opportunities and many different challenges. And I want us just to spend a couple of minutes thinking in terms of public health and in terms of the products that we're all interested in, what this really means, because I think it'll give you a better idea of some of the real challenges and the amount of time regulators are now having to spend focusing on this brave new world of globalization versus the past, where indeed they were focused primarily on domestic production and consumption. If you think about it, the technology that has allowed globalization has also had a very positive impact on promoting and protecting public health, because it's allowed us to make in mass quantities many products much more cheaply and much more effectively than we have in the past. But that same technology has also been used for the mass production of counterfeit, substandard, and falsified products, which in many parts of the world are becoming the currency of organized crime, because as opposed to what are considered illegal drugs, the consequences of being caught for doing this kind of crime are so much less, and yet the rewards can often be equally as good. In this world of globalization, we have internet technology which allows the communication that we were talking about to occur. When there's a safety issue in one part of the world, the rest of us in the world find out about it instantaneously. When we want to talk to our counterparts in regulatory agencies in various parts of the world, regulators can do that on a real-time basis. It's allowed us to indeed be more transparent. It has required us to be more transparent. But it is also a technology that has allowed illicit so-called pharmacies to simply disappear when a regulator or the police start looking. And so this illegal, illicit online pharmacy with the push of a button, because of the technology, no longer exists, just to simply reappear in a different form very soon thereafter. When you look at the world of globalization, you've got a world where, because of the new science that is continually coming out, we're able to begin to think about medicine not as a serendipitous event, such as happened centuries ago, or an observational event that has happened more recently, or even much more of an empiric event, but really looking at the molecular and the genetic basis of disease and how chemicals and other substances can be manufactured and modified to address disease at a molecular, at a genetic level. But yet, while this is happening in one part of the world and people are aware of this incredible amount of detailed knowledge, you have a world where there are incredible disparities in the healthcare and the access to drugs, and where most people are still dying of infections for which we have not yet produced a simple, safe, effective medical product that is affordable and available to the people who need them. It is a world in which we can travel around the world in ways that only our grandparents would have dreamed about during their time, and yet it's a world which, because of this transportation ability, any microorganism, any radiation-emitting device, whether intentionally or not, can be anywhere else in the world in almost 24 hours. So the reality of globalization means that the diseases, the outbreaks that occur anywhere in the world are, for the most part, in reality, 1 or 2 plane flights away from any place else in the world. When you think about some of these realities there, you've got a situation now where in the past, as we mentioned, a product would be manufactured in a country, overseen by that regulator, and used in that country. We now have a globalized world where products or the pieces of products might be produced in one country, might be assembled in another country, might be transported through a third country to get to a fourth country where they're going to be marketed. And at any given point in time, these products or these components might or might not be under the control of a competent regulatory authority. But yet at the end of the day, that finished product is showing up in a country where that country's regulatory authority is responsible for assuring that what's used by its people indeed meet the standards that those people and that agency expect to be met on its own market. So when you think about the 21st century and you think about borders, they are still boundaries, but they're not barriers. They clearly are not barriers to disease, they're not barriers to information flow, and they're not even barriers to product acquisition. We all know on the internet people can find medical products, people have access to medical products. Whether those products are indeed quality products, whether they are indeed even what they say they are, remains to be seen. But the boundary is not the barrier that it has been in the past. But these boundaries are still barriers to regulatory jurisdiction, because the US FDA does not have authority outside the United States. The European Medicines Agency does not have authority outside the European Union. The Chinese FDA does not have authority outside China, and yet these barriers, which are barriers to regulatory jurisdiction, are not barriers to the consequences of the use or misuse of the products these various regulatory agencies are trying to oversee and assure the safety of within their own jurisdiction. I think we also have to remember that some of these imported products, remember the millions of imported products we were talking about, some of these, as we talked about, coming from over 200 different countries, some of these come from countries that perhaps have governments that do not wish well the country that is importing the product. Some come from countries with very little ability to provide the regulatory oversight needed to assure the safety of the products that are exported from their country or that are exported through their countries. And because of this lax oversight in many of the foreign locales, clearly it presents opportunities for contamination, for counterfeiting, and for economic gain by people who wish to game the system and cut corners, feeling that they're not going to get caught when they're transmitting their products or producing their products in areas that don't have the same level of regulatory oversight. So globalization then is, I hope you're beginning to see, has kind of fundamentally changed the environment for regulating food and for regulating medical products. It's created some very unique new challenges for regulators, such as more foreign facilities supplying products, an increasing volume of imported products, more outsourcing of manufacturing to manufacturing sites overseas and often in countries because of the economic conditions and the wages that are normally paid, areas where indeed you don't have often the same level of oversight that you would have had that product been produced in a manufacturing site in another country. Greater complexity in the supply chains, a growing complexity in the products themselves and the manufacturing methods, particularly when we begin thinking about some of the highly complex biopharmaceuticals and some of the other biotech products, when we think of some of the combination products where you're having devices be marketed together with drugs or biotech products, you can see where the complexity continues to grow, not only because of the globalization issue, but because of the complexity of the technologies that are being developed that are the basis for these new kinds of products. We have imports coming to the country from countries with less well-developed regulatory systems, and as I mentioned, all of this also, unfortunately, gives a much greater opportunity for economic fraud. I think no matter where you look around the globe, you will see that resources have not been able to keep up with the reality of globalization. And it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about the US FDA or the European Medicines Agency or a regulatory agency that actually has very limited resources in a low and middle income country. No agency has the resources it needs to do everything that its people in Parliament expect it to do, much less the bandwidth now to do it in this very complex, globalized world that oversees the products that these agencies are responsible for. Back in 2007 and 2008 in the United States, it was really a time that was a bit of a wake-up call relative to the issue of some of the challenges that come from so many of these products being imported from overseas. And it was not that people did not understand that these challenges existed, but in that 12-month period, there were such a series of high-profile incidents that not only at the regulatory level or at the manufacturing level, but really at the public level, people began to realize that this was not some theoretical issue that happened elsewhere. This was something that involved products that came into their own home, and people within various parts of the world, including the United States, began focusing on this problem in ways that perhaps that had not been focused on prior to that. This slide just simply shows you some of the issues that happened in that 12-month period, whether it was the melamine that showed up in pet food and killed many pets in the United States, the melamine that showed up in infant formula and dairy products, not in the United States, but in other parts of the world, the problem that we had with a contaminant in heparin, problems with, not in the United States, but in other parts of the world, hearkening back unbelievably to the same issue that we talked about in the first module that led to the 1938 legislation in the United States, the contamination of a product with diethylene glycol, which again, as you remember, was the contaminant in the sulfanilamide incident back in the mid-1930s here in the United States. Same problem in another part of the world that came up at that point in time. Just to give you an idea that because of these and the very high-profile nature of these incidents in the press, both in the United States and elsewhere, this issue of globalization and what it means to the safety and quality of products that consumers are buying every day around the world really began to take on a much higher degree of importance. And so I think, again, there were lessons that were learned through that particular 12-month period that kind of set the foundation for how regulators, manufacturers, and consumers at large were beginning to look at this problem and how they were going to begin to think of ways to begin to address it. From the regulator perspective, I think regulators in various parts of the world began to realize that in order to do their job more effectively at home, they have to do their jobs more effectively abroad. And since they have no authority abroad, that means they have to be better integrated into what was becoming a global regulatory enterprise. And they had to do this by building on the foundation of relationships that they had established in the years preceding this particular point in time. So this was the beginning of realizing that you can't just focus domestically, that in order to do your domestic mission, because your mission hasn't changed, you have to look beyond your borders and figure out how beyond your borders you're going to act and interact in order to get the information you need to do the job at home that your own parliament and your own people and you as a regulator expect yourself to be doing. From the industry perspective, I think people were beginning to realize that the brand reputation that they have in many very important markets is really dependent upon the quality of the suppliers with whom they choose to engage. Because when something goes terribly wrong in an important market, the consumer does not focus on the supplier who gave you an inferior component. What the consumer is focusing on, what the lawyers are focusing on, what the regulators are focusing on, is you as a company who has taken responsibility for that product within the jurisdiction. So not only your product, but your brand as a company is no longer just dependent on your own entity, but all of those whom you now have chosen to be suppliers for whatever reason. And this happens both at an individual corporate level and also in industry-wide brands. The idea that if people can't trust toys, if people can't trust tires, if people can't trust cough syrup, then it's not just one brand, but it brings the idea of questioning the safety and the quality of all of these products into people's minds when they start thinking about what they want to purchase, what they need to purchase, and from whom they will make their purchase. And then from the consumer's perspective, I think people begin to realize that when it comes to things that are as important as your food and as your drugs, maybe something that is cheapest does not always have the most desirable attributes. That in order to assure a certain level of quality in your food and in your drugs, there is a cost that is involved, and how you calculate that cost and what that cost is that consumers are willing to pay in order to assure the quality of the products became a very real challenge that people, both at the consumer level, at the industry level, and at the regulator level, were having to begin to deal with. So the impact of globalization is that it has driven many of the changes that we have seen in the past 25 years, as opposed to the public health crises that drove so many of the changes in the early and mid-20th century. It really is globalization that has driven the changes that we are beginning to see in the last half of the 20th century, or the last quarter of the 20th century, and now as we go into the 21st century. Some of these changes have involved fundamental changes in the roles and the expectations of medical products regulators. One of the main changes is that in the past, as we mentioned, you kind of had three big players, both from the regulatory perspective and the manufacturing perspective, and that was the United States and the European Union and Japan. And now, as we've moved forward 20 to 25 years, we find that there are many significant players, that these three are still obviously significant players, but they're not the only significant players. And how these new significant players are integrated into the regulatory enterprise and how the interaction occurs and is built with all of the new players is one of the impacts of globalization that is driving much of the change that we're seeing. I think what you're finding fundamentally, and I hope you're beginning to see as kind of the theme that is the thread throughout this presentation, is that we've gone from an early 20th century model and a mid-20th century model where regulators were for the most part independent and they were focusing only on their own jurisdiction, to a post-globalization world where now regulators are interdependent, that have to figure out how they act and how they interact within the global regulatory enterprise in order to do the best job for their local jurisdiction. I mentioned the role of regulators, and I think you've heard me say, and it is true, that regulators still have to remain focused on their domestic mission, because that is their mission. Even going from the 20th century model to this post-globalization 21st century model, the fundamental mission of the agency to protect and promote public health within its jurisdiction where it has authority has not changed. But yet they're being called to do this in a world that, as you've seen, is fundamentally different. And they're called upon to do things that historically, back in the 20th century model, they were not called upon to do, such as playing a role in trying to strengthen fragile states, because there are products that we depend on that come from these states, trying to promote social and economic progress in areas where indeed doing so would lead to a higher standard of quality on a consistent basis, trying to protect their own jurisdiction's security from substandard or perhaps even purposefully contaminated products that might be shipped into their jurisdiction, and also as part of this global enterprise to be part of their country's public diplomacy and an expression of the compassion of their own people for people who are in situations that are perhaps quite different from the situation they are in, and yet there are situations because of these products and because of the globalization that they are bound together. Again, roles that these regulators are being asked to play for which they are not historically missioned and for which they have not historically been given the resources to do. I think you also find that the role of regulators is being challenged and being made much more complex, because they have still this historic role of being the gatekeeper, of trying to keep bad products off the market, however we want to define bad, which we'll say basically are products that don't have a positive benefit risk profile, or products that are not manufactured in a quality manner. But at the same time, trying to be gate openers to help facilitate quality products getting to patients as quickly as possible. And doing this by not lowering international standards and trying to work with communities to better understand what is their tolerance for the risk of a product, particularly when it comes to medical products for serious and unmet medical needs. Because this division between being a gatekeeper and being a gate opener is really, in many situations, a very narrow, nuanced difference of how you look at the risks and whether you as a community are willing to tolerate those risks at a given point in time, given the risks of the disease entity that you're trying to deal with. Regulators, as you've learned, are responsible for the coordination of the product life cycle oversight. They're, as you remember, are responsible for facilitating ethical, scientifically valid clinical trials. They're responsible for facilitating and performing efficient, science-based dossier assessments that are robust and efficient and transparent. They are also responsible for developing strong post-authorization systems for safety reporting and product distribution control and lifelong learning about a product and reanalyzing and refocusing that new knowledge so that the product can be used in the most safe and the most effective way. So it is a life cycle regulatory oversight program that, as we mentioned, is being reinformed by new knowledge and appropriately communicated. And you can imagine in the old 20th century world, when all of this was happening within your own jurisdiction, you had much greater control over what was happening. But in this post-globalization world, all components of this, whether it's the clinical trials, the assessment, or the post-authorization oversight, is happening within the globalized context of globalized commodities, globalized databases, and products that at any given point in time might or might not be under the control of a competent regulatory authority. I think, as we've said and as we've looked through this, when we talk about the impact on the expectations of agencies in this post-globalization world, whether it's the FDA or others, no agency, as we've said earlier, has the resources, the experience, or the insights to do everything expected by its parliament and people. In order to do the best job possible, agencies must work with other trusted agencies to leverage resources, whether they're human resources, scientific resources, inspectional resources, financial resources. And I think, as you'll see as we talk about some of the ideas and some of the efforts that are underway to address these challenges, you'll see where work sharing and work product sharing is coming to become more and more the norm to help inform jurisdictions, to help inform decisions within a jurisdiction without needlessly repeating work